Hey guys, A Day, you have never done one of these before, for me anyway. So just a little introduction. B Day, you can skip just a little bit ahead. But A Day, basically what these are video lessons. So it's just like me talking in class, except that you can pause and rewind as much as you want. So if I'm going too fast, feel free to pause it, take a minute to jot down everything that you want. You can write down other notes that I say if that helps you. If not, you can just go through with me at my pace. So this will be about 10 or 15 minutes, and there will be questions along the way. So what I need you to hand in to me is the notes and the questions. So both I want to see because I want to make sure you're following along. If you prefer Cornell style, that's great. We're going to do them just like we do in class. Okay, so just take a second and complete this warm-up question. And take as much time as you need. So again, feel free to pause. How do you think the native populations, so people that already were living in the Americas, such as those formerly part of the Aztec and Inca empires, interacted with the Europeans? How do you think the Europeans treated these native populations, and how do you think the native populations treated the Europeans? And why do you think this is? Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about is something called the Encomienda system. So the Europeans came across from Europe, obviously, and landed in the Americas and began to colonize. So think about Pizarro and Cortez and how those two explorers conquered those populations. After they conquered those populations, the Queen Isabella, installed something called Encomienda in order to try and quell the conflict between the native population of Indians and the Spanish who were now settling there. So this Encomienda system was a legal system by which the Spanish crown, the king or queen, attempted to define the status of Indian population in its American colonies. So this becomes a form of enslavement. And how this happens is that a conquistador, or a European landowner, in the New World would be granted power from the crown over a certain number of Indians. And I put Indians in quotes because remember, Columbus thought he was in India and he was not. So these people were called Indians, but they weren't really Indians, obviously. So when we say Indians, we just mean all the native people that were already living in North and South America by the time the Europeans got there. So these native people were put under the power of the Europeans, and this is how they were officially granted political power over the Indians' lands. And so the Indians could be taxed at their discretion because they were in control of by the conquistadors. But the conquistadors were required to protect the Indians and also to teach them the Christian faith. Keep in mind those motivations for European exploration. So remember that glory, God, and gold. And the glory, God, and gold really comes into play with the Encomienda system because they needed the glory of having political power over native peoples. They needed God. They needed more Christian followers, or they wanted more Christian followers. And they also wanted the gold. So that comes from taxes, and it also comes from the labor that the Indians produced while they were being controlled by the Europeans. So that's how it becomes a sort of slave trade, or a slave system. The much more famous slave system in the Americas, though, is the transatlantic slave trade. So, as you know, during the Columbian Exchange, diseases from European populations killed off many of the Native Americans. So things like smallpox, chickenpox, those sorts of things, that was deadly to the Native Americans. And by Native Americans, I mean all Americans, not just those living in what is today the United States. So new lands and different people to conquer led to the transatlantic slave trade. At the same time as Europeans were drastically killing populations of Indians, they were also not only exploring in America, but they established ports in Africa and were exploring those civilizations and those people. So they're seeing a great decline in one part of their settlement, and also all these people on hand to them in Africa. So in order to refill their labor force in the colonies in the Americas, they saw it that it would be totally okay to take slaves or people from Africa and use them as their labor force in what was formerly the Indians' role. So they couldn't use the Indians because they were killing all of them with their diseases, and just the Indians were fighting back against the Europeans taking their territory, etc. So take a look for a second. Focus on where these slaves were coming from. So you can see the fatter arrows are where the more volume of slaves were going. So mostly from Western Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, to the Spanish colonies. Not as many, surprisingly, to North America. So mostly to Cuba, Mexico a little bit, but all those coastal regions, Brazil. One of the reasons for this is that the Portuguese had all these ports in West Africa thanks to Prince Henry the Navigator, and thanks to not Francisco Pizarro, thanks to Amerigo Vespucci, all these ports were established in Brazil. So the Portuguese really dominated this slave trade. You can also see here, the bigger the bubble means the more slaves that were transported there. So our first checkpoint, and these checkpoints are the questions that you don't need to write down the question, but you do need to write down your answers, and you need to answer all of them. So number 2, what was the Encomienda system in your own words? What did the Europeans give to the Indians in the Encomienda system? So what did the Indians get from the Europeans? What were they required to give the Indians? Number 4, what role did the Indians play in the European economy? And number 5, why were slaves taken from Africa to the Americas? Why didn't they just use the Indians they had? Okay, second part of this video lesson is called regional slavery, and that's what we're going to spend the next couple lessons on after your quiz. So I'm giving you some of the notes now, but most of the lesson stuff we're going to be doing after the quiz. So the goal question here is, how did the slave experience differ regionally? The first way we're going to look at it is economically. And by regionally, I mean between North and South America. So North America, we're not going to talk about too much because you probably already have some background on that slave system. But we're really going to be talking about the South American system. So in South America, they mostly produced sugarcane, and by South America, I mean the Caribbean and Brazil. And this was terribly backbreaking labor. It was very, very difficult. In North America, however, labor was used for cotton, rice, and other crops. Still not easy work by any means, but you can see the picture there has slaves doing the backbreaking labor of breaking down sugar cane and harvesting that, rather than our typical image of picking cotton in a cotton field. Demographically, there were far more females in North America than in South America, so there was a much higher death rate also. Socially, in North America, slaves and slave owners were divided by black and white. In South America, this was not as clear-cut. There was this hyper-detailed social classifications of miscegenation, which means mixing of races. So some Indians may have married Europeans, and then their child may have married an African, and so ethnicity and race is not as clear-cut as in America, when it was two distinct social classes and they were very divided socially. The slave experience differs regionally also in terms of resistance. So in Brazil, they had these things called quilombos, which were escaped slave communities deep in the jungle and marshland of Brazil. So these were similar to the maroonage of the US, but we're going to talk more about these quilombos and how they really developed politically as their own entities and their own communities. In the US, or what is currently the US, they had maroonage. So this meant that slaves would run away and form communities that would be constantly on the move to avoid recapture. So they were kind of traveling bands of communities. The third thing is silent sabotage. So slaves who purposefully pretended to not understand instructions, not how to use tools or animals, or feigned illness. So feigned means faked. So the silent sabotage was a way of them protesting without being extremely vocal or direct about it. So this was a way that they could sabotage the plantation by not completing their work, but they were just seen as sort of incompetent slaves rather than somebody who wanted to sabotage the plantation or outright protest or outright escape. In the South America and Caribbean, they had a need for black labor, so they often offered manumission, which manumission is simply the freeing of enslaved Africans. So the reason they just voluntarily freed these slaves is because a lot of the times this would help the economy. They were still kept socially limited by racism, and North America, though, didn't have this manumission. We usually, slaves in North America were kept as slaves, and they were rarely offered freedom. Usually it was if they had a very personal relationship with their master, then they would be offered manumission, and it was still called manumission, but it was not as prominent as it was in South America or the Caribbean. Okay, checkpoint number 2. How did North and South America differ in terms of crops cultivated by slaves? Why do you think the racial classification was not as developed or as detailed in North America as in South America? What are the 3 forms of resistance, and in which America, North or South, did each form of resistance take place? Why do you think abolition, which is the advocacy for freeing of all slaves or the abolishment of slavery, was more prominent social issue in American history rather than South American history? And our last question is, do you think slavery was experienced in the same way across regions? If so, why? If not, how do you think they differed? And that's everything I've got for you. So you are done your homework if once you answer all those questions.